All right.
No,
Well,
AT&T.
welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Brenda Ratchik. I'm from Mexico City. I'm a horror author, and I'm currently enrolled at the Stone Coast MFA program. Would you mind introducing yourself? So would you like to start, Cristina?
Hi, everybody. I'm Cristina Jurado, if you're Anglophone. I'm a writer. I'm a bilingual writer. I mainly write in Spanish, but I also write occasionally in English. I'm a translator. I'm a speculative fiction promoter and an editor. I live in Dubai, although I'm from Spain. And in my house, we speak 4 languages, because it's relevant for this panel: English, Spanish, French, and Arabic. I currently have, as you can see up here, a flip book called Del Naranja al Azul en Bionautas, which is 2 sides of the kind of like the same story. And it's in Spanish, but Bionautas is coming out in English very soon in a new platform called Twine.
Awesome, thank you. How about you, RM?
So I'm RM Virtues. I am primarily a romance writer. I'm branching out into horror and fantasy currently. I am from the United States, originally New Mexico. I now live in Nevada. I am a primarily English writer, but I have been learning multiple languages very slowly. I know some Spanish. I've been learning Nahuatl, which is our indigenous native language, one of the native languages in Mexico. And I also learning Greek. So I use both of those slightly, not a lot yet, but moving into that.
That's very impressive.
Es Christus.
And Joaquin, please introduce yourself.
I am Joaquin, Joaquin Gil. You can say Gil, Joaquin Gil in Spanish, or the way I'm known in Boston. No one can say Joaquin, is Joaquin type thing. So I get to be called Kino, which is a nickname I have been dragging around through the world for some time. I write mostly science fiction, although I occasionally write satire and also fantasy. I have tried a little bit of that. I am not very good at other genres. That's why I haven't attempted it. My sarcasm is enough to take me into some different directions, but it's not all powerful. So that's it. I do a lot of work at the confluence of art and science. I'm also an anthropologist and a biologist, so that gets in the way of the way you look at things. And I like to draw, and I have several semi-professions in the art world, including animation. So I use that to make graphic novels using 3D tools and drawings mixed. I love mixed media in the word and in the image, and also in the sound. I like all the worlds, and I cannot see the dotted lines that separate one activity from the other. And it's not being a cashier in a bank or the times I worked in restaurants, but it's kind of a unity for me. So I offer that.
Thank you. And Amina or Amena, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Would you please introduce yourself?
Hi, so thanks. My name's Amena Jamali, and I am a primarily epic fantasy writer. So as you can see, my first book, The Bell Tolling, part of my series, The Lord of Freedom, I have experience with the multiple languages. So although it doesn't sound that way, I'm actually not a native English speaker. My native language is a combination of Arabic, Urdu, Hindi, and Gujarati, primarily Gujarati in the speaking and Urdu in the writing. So I can understand spoken Gujarati and read written Urdu. So it makes for a rather interesting combination of abilities. I can also understand Hindi to some extent, but I can't reply in either Hindi or. I've also formally studied Arabic. So my speaking of it is not that great, but reading, writing, particularly the religious use of Arabic, pretty decent if I do say so myself. I've also extensively studied Spanish, but even in this, my abilities mostly in reading and writing. I also study French, Greek, French and Greek for fun. I have studied Latin formally, but most of my learning now is just for fun. So I tend to combine these languages however it really suits me, but with a very strong Arabic influence, since that is the language that I have heard around me outside of school for most of my life, in terms of like that's been the prestigious language of my childhood. And so all of that comes out in my writing. And as I said, I primarily write epic fantasy. And for a bit of background outside of that, I work in cybersecurity, so computer languages are also something I understand, maybe not well enough to be like a very skilled coder or something, but I do understand them.
But can you code?
So it's been a while. I can code in a bit of C and a bit of Java.
Right.
It's more that it's more that I understand a lot of how software works and how those languages make up things. So I couldn't break it down for myself, but I could explain it to myself and to other people. I'm an auditor by profession, cybersecurity auditor. So it's a useful ability to be able to understand that.
Of course, Brenda. Hello, everyone. I'm Darío Aguilar Peregrina. I'm the author of the Hurricanes 207 saga, Latin Dancing, Brigade DXT, and the 3 Wiz Young Men. Also, I'm a columnist for Hello Arte Canada and ambassador for the Latin American Cultural Heritage, La CUE in New York. There, we also organize various book fairs for the Latin community. So, hello, everyone.
My first question for all of you would be, what audience do you write for when you write multilingual stories? Do you focus on other multilingual readers or cater toward one main language or the other? Would you like to start, Amena?
So I write in English. I'm starting to dabble into commissioning Spanish translations. So I suppose you could say I write for readers of English. I haven't yet struck that balance, but it is my hope to write fantasy that isn't so complicated in the vocabulary that someone who is not a native English speaker, because I'm not a native English speaker, couldn't understand and read it. So that's definitely one dimension. The other is that since there's so much Arabic and Indian and just non-English influence, it makes my stories more appealing to people who are interested in those things. That's how I would put it.
How about you, RM?
So I think it depends really on the story that I'm telling. I think with my most recent book, which is a serial on Patreon called What We Call Worship, that was the book where I first started using Nahuatl. And I think it was really for people like me, indigenous Mexican people who are living in America, get back to their roots and reconnect. And it's kind of difficult, especially because the resources are so limited here. So I really wanted to write that story for them, and just so that, you know, it's kind of like a mark, like we can say we were here, we are here, we're so I kind of write for those people that just want to feel seen and connected to. Um, but I think most of my work altogether, the most fluid part of my work is probably the use of AAVE, which is also a dialect of African American dialect here in America. And I think it is important to use, just because we're still having, you know, editors flag it, non-Black editors flag it when we're sending in these stories. So I use it a lot, these words, in, you know, real world application. So I feel like it's important to see that in stories as well, especially, and even fantasy, sci-fi, romance stories. But yeah, it really just depends on the story I'm trying to tell, and who that would basically tell me who the audience is going to be. And I kind of write towards that audience once I know what the story is.
And how about you, Joaquin?
Ooh. As I said, I write a lot in English, but since my roots are in Spanish, and I can dabble in Italian, French, German, and, you know, a couple forms of slang and computer languages. It's let's say I cannot choose my market with any degree of precision. I am a very a very mixed mix of traditions and cultures. So I take only two positions. I don't write for a market or a specific segment because of these. One is that in my life, which has been long and foolish, I have met a lot of situations where multilingualism is the fact of life. When I was growing up, a lot of my classmates were German or Dutch or Australian or Italian, and there were communities in Costa Rica of these nationalities. So when you go to school, you hear different things from Spanish because the kids are talking, we are talking among ourselves, right? So you start cussing in Dutch and things like that, and and uh, you get very used to languages being something you can learn, and some things that exist you can break into them and communicate with other people. And the other thing is that I believe that many people in the world today have that community of experience of having many languages around. So that's what I do. I try to relive those moments in which I have been with people that speak to me no matter how. Gestures, sound, grunts, pieces. Sometimes none of the speakers say that I'm talking with someone and I don't know, say, more than Efcharistos of Greek, and the other person doesn't know anything of Spanish but Buenas noches. And maybe, I don't know, maybe the languages that we speak are different enough that we have to guess a lot. And that is fun. That is tremendously fun. I mean, when I was younger, I was a tour guide. And believe me, I had fun doing that. And not only with the older tourists, but sometimes you had someone your age, and it was totally fun, especially if you hit it out. But anyway, that is the thing. So community of experience is my guide. All humans hear a lot of languages. And the only thing that we really need is some kind of prompt to understand what the other thing is. The fact that we are here with so different experiences, and we're actually getting in this electronic space, and we're together, and we can resonate our ideas ones on the others, and we're talking, and the other guys are going like this, and I'm going like that too. So we see that we can communicate, even if for some of us the language we're doing this in is not our native language. Still, we can communicate through it, because part of it is the language, but part of it is the community of experience that lets you jump ahead and make connections and all that. So yeah, I write for people just as foolish as I am.
I love that. Yeah. And how about you, Cristina?
So I've never really think about my writing as, writing for someone within my speaking community. I rather not do that. What I write, I think it's pretty universal. I write science fiction and horror and fantasy and a mix of all of them and new weird. And I hope I'm not writing for a certain audience. I think I am writing for everybody. And because precisely, I think speculative fiction and literature in general, it's a universal language in itself. I think imagination is a universal language by itself. And I think that we are hungry, all of us, from any country, from any literary tradition, are hungry for stories. And I think that the world opening up and being able to, like what are we doing right now, like talk from different parts of the world and coming together to share our experiences, it's something that shows that there is an interest in sharing our stories and discovering other literary traditions. So I hope that people, when they read my stories, they know that they're going to find something that reflects my multiculturalism, something that I did not plan to have. I was going to be a boring person living in Spain, writing whatever. And then I am here in the Middle East and, with a French background also. And I didn't mention that in the beginning, but I also had to learn Basque, which is a language that's spoken in the Basque country in the north of Spain that not many people speak, and I haven't been able to speak much about it because I don't think anybody here speaks. But I can pray in that. I can pray in Basque. So I try to incorporate all that because it's who I am. So it comes really naturally. I can't help it. And what is more interesting is I don't think that my accent or my accent in writing, because we can talk about that also maybe later, defines what I'm writing. But I found interesting, it's something that I wanted to share with all of you, is that I published the same story in Spanish and English, and it's a short story, and I had to do some tweaking, but not in the vocabulary, in the structure. That was very, very interesting. And I thought that I would have assumed that the tweeting and the polishing would have come from the vocabulary and the translation, and it wasn't that. It was actually the structure. It's just because Anglo-Saxon audiences kind of like expect something in the beginning, like a very strong, punchy kind of beginning. And in my country, in Spain, we like to kind of like more subtle starting, and just start with something really, really strong. It will kind of like put you off a little bit and will be too rude or too strong or too harsh. So I thought that was kind of interesting because I never expected that. And that's what I've learned, that I learned that it's not necessarily the writing itself, like the words, it's somehow the structure sometimes that could be kind of change and transform a little bit to match the expectations of the audience. And so far I had this experience in Spanish and English. I don't know whether if I try to do it in French or in Arabic, would it be different, but I bet it could. So yeah, that's what I can tell you.
And languages are expression of culture, so it makes total sense what you're saying.
Okay, well, on this case, I actually like to create my stories for everyone. For example, Hurricanes 2007 is an action-packed story, but has Latin characters, but also American characters. So I try to combine these things into one narrative. And then at the end of the day, it works. For example, in Hurricanes, when I won this award, the Peregrina Awards in the United States, they told me, hey, the story is really awesome because you combine your Mexican heritage, your Latin heritage, and also you create a story like Maze Runner, like The Day After Tomorrow, that is one of my favorite movies, and also one other movie, 28 Days Later from Danny Boyle. It's a combination of these different genres that shouldn't work, but they work. So it's really amazing, no? Another example, Brenda and friends, it's Latin dancing. Latin dancing is a recent work I have made, and it's all about my Latin culture. I'm very proud for being a Latino, and Latin dancing demonstrates all the music, all the culture from Latin America in a video game. But I want people from other countries to appreciate our culture. So I want this to be like a commercial for tourism for Latin America. So, for example, if you are seeing one day, I hope, no, the Latin dancing adaptation, hey, this is like the video game, this is like the movie I saw. Mexico City is a real place. Bogota, Colombia is a really beautiful place. So I really want that for my stories. At the end, I don't have any audience predetermined because I want my stories to be heard around the world and also to people to enjoy it. That's why I have a diversity of characters. And at the end, and also I want people to like these stories, even if they are not Latino. I want really to have them to enjoy this story. So basically that's my answer, Brenda and friends.
All right. And how does your knowledge and inclusion of multiple languages enhance your stories and words? RM, would you like to begin with that one? You kind of already mentioned some of it.
Yeah, I realized like I kind of used my answer for this question for the last one. But again, it really does for me and the worlds that I create, because I'm very big on world building. So the language is always really important to think about. And for me, it kind of just adds to the magic, especially just in learning Nahuatl and in learning Greek. They have been really fun. I've had a great time. I've fallen in love with learning again because I've been learning these languages. It is difficult, obviously, because they're both two different alphabets. So it's me constantly, and the same letter doesn't make the same sound in any of the three languages I already speak. So it's just like, it is difficult to kind of decide which one's more important, or what's going to go on in a set world. It's been easy right now because obviously I've written like, obviously I use Greek in my Greek myth retellings, and I use Nahuatl in my stories about a fictional or reimagined pre-colonial or uncolonized Mexico. And so obviously there's set worlds already, so it's easy to put those languages in there because they already belong there. But I think when building the world, what comes most importantly is just how it's integrated into the magic system that I'm using, the communities that I'm using, how other communities interact? Are these isolated communities? Does everybody in the region speak the same language, dialect, et cetera? And so those always have to be taken into account. But again, it really just on the outside of that, as the writer and the reader, it just feels like, oh, you know, this is a place for you. You belong here. Like they're speaking, literally speaking, you know, my language. So it feels like, oh, this is a world that had me in mind. So that's also important for me to make my readers feel like, oh, you know, the writer had us in mind. They were thinking about us. They made this world authentic to us. And that's always been really important to me, especially again in, you know, reconnecting to my roots and trying to, you know, learn this language that, you know, only maybe 3 or 4 members of my family can still speak. It's something that it takes great care to put that in there. But it really is for me, just like I always want to, you know, make sure that my culture is reflected in my writing. It's, you know, very important to me, to my spirituality, to, you know, everything else that goes into my writing. So it can't really be, you know, ignored or treated as like a secondary decision that was made. It always has to come on in the primary of building that world. So I think it really does, for me, is just kind of one of those things of like, oh yeah, this is that world. This is the world I created for myself and other people like me, so that we can feel comfortable in a place where we can escape. And it's not really about just the hardship of people who speak that language or about, you know, the struggles. Like you kind of just get to actually escape and still be around people that speak your language.
How about, thank you. How about you, Cristina?
It's so funny because preparing this panel, I was thinking about it and realized that I incorporated extensively who I am in my writing without even thinking about it. And I think it made it interesting in the sense that it's not what you normally, at least not what I normally read in magazines, in, you know, literary magazines in the English circuit. Because lately I'm writing, right now I'm doing a fantasy fixed up on superheroes that are, you know, not their typical superheroes. They have very unusual superpowers, not about being, you know, super strong or super fast. One of the characters, it's someone who's able to speak any language with no accent. It's just by just touching someone, a native, she can acquire that capability. And I realized that there must be a reason why I chose that superpower. It's also because it works in the story, because those are mercenaries, and this is very useful if you're working around the world to blend in with your words. But I also realized that kind of like I did it because it reflects who I am in a way. So who you are comes out in your writing. And what has been really, really fun is to incorporate, because to show the multilingual part of you know, of her, I use expressions of any language you think about: Dutch, French, English, Spanish, Basque, Catalan, Gallego. I try not to use, you know, Japanese, I mean, Asian or even Middle Eastern ones because of the alphabets, but just wanted to use something that we could use with our alphabet and stuff. And but I'm thinking about it, maybe incorporated others. I just, you know, I think it's a lot of fun. That something that I've been struggling, because in the beginning, when you learn another language, you struggle. And I still remember when I didn't know how to speak proper English, even though right now it's not like I speak really like, I write better than I speak it, but it was a struggle like anything else. And I just wanted to make that a superpower. And I think that's just that decision, because I think writing is about decisions. Writing is it's constantly taking decisions, and that's why it's so tiring sometimes. It's hard to explain to someone why you get so tired of writing when you're writing. It's not of writing when you're writing, it's because you're taking decisions all the time. So just that decision of speaking languages a superpower, I think it's just a statement, even a political statement in somehow, because it talks about inclusion, diversity, and away from xenophobia. And I think that I come to realize that instead of trying to mask my accent when I'm speaking, or even, try to blend in my writing, I just decided to incorporate it and embrace it. And I think it's beautiful. And there's a lot of people out there that appreciate it, I think. So instead of fighting it, I spend a lot of time trying to mask my own accent. I decided, no, I'm just gonna go for it. And I don't care if I think accents are beautiful. Everybody has an accent, and we should embrace it and not look down on people who uses. It's the same thing with the Spanish. Some people in my country, in Spain, because it's a colonial country, look down on the other types of, and the other varieties of Spanish in Latin America, for example. And I think that's so wrong. And I love the different types of Spanish, the different vocabulary. And I think we should cherish it and embrace it, and don't ever look down on anybody because of their accent or because of the variety of language they're using.
And how about you, Amena?
So this question of how I use multiple languages in my world is an interesting one, because my world is a fantasy world, not at all set in our world, and with a completely different history from our world, one that does not, it doesn't diverge from real world history. It's not an alternate telling of real world history. It is simply its own history. And I've put a lot of effort into designing that history to be completely independent. So every choice and every consequence that comes from the beginning is natural. Like, it's not influenced by my own study of history of our world. So it makes for a very interesting setting in which to put multilingualism. So as I mentioned in my previous answers, some of that is just like RM, like Cristina, like Joaquin are saying. Some of that is just me, that I speak so many languages, that even though I'm writing in English, English is not my first language. So it just naturally comes out. I have names that, some of my names are Arabic, some of my names are Latin, some of my names are Spanish, some of my names sound a little Greek, some of my names sound like, who knows where that came from, but it's a name. And it sounds interesting enough for me to put in the story. It sounds fantastic, which is, I think, the point of names in fantasy. But so that's more of the subconscious way that there is inclusion of multilingualism in my story. The more overt thing is more of my theory of languages. So as I've kind of hinted at before, I come from a culture where there is a common language, and then there is a language of faith and spirituality and of high sophistication. And having a lot of education in the Western classical tradition, that is that same kind of, not as like pointedly, but still that's some of that same kind of thinking that I have kind of absorbed over time. And then there is also simply the effect of living in the United States, living in a place like Texas, and knowing that you are expected to speak a specific language, and being a minority, if you mix in other words with your language, that's not really professional, and it's frowned upon. So both bad and good. I kind of translated that into my world as there is a language of magic and religion and high ceremony, and then there is a language of politics and common speaking. And these two languages are very different in the sense of complexity and in how many people can speak them, how easy it is to learn them, all those sorts of things. The only thing is, though, that since the story is supposed to be in that common tongue, it is the language of magic in which I've poured all of my efforts in creating meaning and names. So I've basically, what I'm saying is that I've created a language for my stories, a language that, and this is where the computer programming comes in, that I use some of those ideas in order to create a language that isn't like the languages I know, because it's supposed to be its own thing. And in that, I've poured all the languages I've studied, parts of all of them, and lumped them together in object-oriented programming fashion to create words that don't sound like our words and don't necessarily rely upon it. And yet, if you read it, you would think that there is some Spanish, some Arabic, some Latin. It sounds like a language that, or at least maybe it does to me because I wrote it, but it sounds like a language that you know, but at the same time, you really don't. And that is where that knowledge of languages is most overtly in play. And it shapes a good portion of my story because my characters regard the use of language and the use of writing as a means of culture and education.
Thank you. And how about you, Joaquin?
As Jabba the Hutt said once, vara crispa grito, preguntándole a Han Solo why had he, asking Han Solo why had he fried Greedo, the guy with the two antennas. So when you travel the first time, there's something that you become aware of, and it's the world around you. Before that, you take it for granted. That's it. It's the world. Big deal. The moment you are subject finally to something else, something that you're not used to in any form or in very little form, it's a shock and it becomes something noticeable and something you are aware of. Sometimes for a long time, depending how long you take to get used to it. So my point is that your worldviews only got wider. There's a shock in title, and there's a period of adjustment, sure, but your worldview got bigger. And when I am writing, the kind of world, let's talk about something specific, that the Road to Xibalbá, which is based, these are Victorian science fiction based on legends from the Popol Vuh, which is the, I see RM smiling big, of course, is the book of council of the Maya Quiche. And this is I have to go back a little bit to be able to answer this with the kind of spirit that you guys have shown. When I started with thinking about steampunk and about writing this convergence of Victorian Far West with El Desierto type things that I use in my stories. And I decided that I wanted las tribus getting around and the tribes. And I realized that what happened with the British steampunk, to call it something, is that it had all to do with Babylon and Egypt and the old world cultures, which are fantastic. But in America, we have something just as cool, which are the Mayas, the Olmecas, the damn Incas, the Chibcha civilization, which nobody mentions often, but it's like pretty awesome. And there's like, maybe a dozen that I'm omitting in this brief recount. But the point is, we can write about old sacrifices, strange lost practices, old gods, strange creatures before the human, all the tropes of steampunk and Victorian horror slash sci-fi become renewed. They get a really interesting transfusion of blood when you try to do that in America. Because we have really crazy civilizations dotting the landscape and the historic landscape. So why not? My question is not why do I take all these elements, but why could I avoid it? And the multilingualism, as Amena was saying, is sometimes not a result of how many languages you know, but of trying to create an experience which you can invest with vitality, which becomes true for the reader, in other words. And then you use tricks. Like, for instance, if I'm writing about Egypt, I have not been to Egypt, much less in the times that I write about, which is in the early 18th century, right? So no way, I hadn't been around just yet. So what I do is I take maps, for instance, this is a kind of thing. I would take a map of the city in that era, decide where I'm going from where to where, and work a little bit with historic descriptions, real history books and photographs of the places to weave, say, waiting until the time of the appointment, having a coffee by the Bosphorus and watching the barges go by. I have been in other rivers and have seen other barges go by, so I know about the rhythm. So I just get my fez on and, go to town in a different town. And those are tricks that every writer uses. Those are like in the times of Kenneth Robinson and Doc Savage and things like that in the 50s. That kind of trick was it's even recommended by some of the authors of the times. You seek a map, you seek the telephone guide, and you find some data about the place you're writing, and you might have never been to Akron, Ohio, but there are things that you can find today in the internet pretty easily. It takes all of 5 minutes to get a blueprint of something that could, if read by a native of Akron, Ohio, won't sound fake. And if read by someone who's never been to Akron, Ohio, won't sound fake either. And that's the whole point. It's not about being completely realistic. It's about eliciting and eliciting emotions, yes, but dodging the issue of the too profuse descriptions. I'm not Jules Verne. I'm not going to spend 5 pages in this scenery. But I can draw it and I can find pictures, and the internet is fantastic, but I'm skipping ahead. That is how I would say multilingualism enriches my writing, by making it wider, by making the landscapes bigger, and allowing me to pull those tricks. Sometimes I have one of my characters speak Swedish because I need to, and sometimes it's because they want. I am actually following in the keyword what they want, and I'm like, why is this guy suddenly Swede? I thought he was just a redhead, but he insists on using words like mormor, which is grandma. Why? Where is this coming from? I don't know, but I follow it. By now, I trust that the voices, yes, they tell me to do things, but these things are kind of cool to do. So I pay attention and go to town. And as I said earlier, when I feel it's right, when it looks like life, that you can find things you do understand and things you have to say, huh, what? That's the title of our conference. Like, what? What was that? Como? So yeah, that's languages enrich, and they can enrich to what we write. And more importantly, they can enrich the people we write for. So why not? Kind of devil's advocate there.
I agree.
Salud.
Salud.
Oh, well, when I'm combining English and Spanish words, sometimes I really get tired because it's sometimes a little bit difficult. Speaking Spanish, writing in English, but at the same time, trying to adapt my story, because Brenda and friends, I normally write in Spanish first, and then I translate to English. Or sometimes I write in English and then in Spanish. It's difficult, but it's a process that I really like, because I told to myself, okay, as a Latino reader, I'm going to like this exposition that Darío is writing. But also I am really interested to see how is the English version. So I try not to change so much of the Spanish version in the English version. What I mean is, I like to have the heart of the story that is in Spanish and the heart of the story in English intact. I like them to be 99% the same. That's my idea for an adaptation. That's my idea for the story to work. I have, at the moment, I have some good results, some not of all, because, for example, hurricanes, when I first published the book in 2019, people told me, Darío, your story is great, but it seems like you were a little bit literal. You literally told the story. The story, Brenda and friends, look at like a strange story of characters that don't relate at the first, but then thanks to that criticisms and also the reviews of the audience, I knew I needed to change some things in the sequel. So in the sequel, I changed my style so I could create a story that is easy to follow, but at the same time, it's complex like I wanted at first. That's my answer, Brenda and friends.
Awesome. So now we're going to a more of a technical territory. So when do you include or imply translations in your work? Amena, would you like to begin?
Okay, so this is actually a topic on which I have spent a lot of time, considering I have a language that literally no one knows what that language is before they read the book, unless like no one knows that language. I wouldn't even say unless me, because I make it up as I'm writing, or rather make it up as I'm like I put together words and such when a chapter or the entire book is done. So I have kind of dealt with it two ways. There are certain things that don't get translated. So each, as part of my, as part of the mythos of my story, there is apparently a mysterious character who compiled this book out of another language, translated it, and is giving us a translation in, is giving, or, you know, technically giving me the translation, and I'm putting it in English and presenting it to the audience. So that title that mysterious character apparently wrote, that title doesn't really get translated. But there are many places that my characters do grand feats of magic or engage in some or another kind of ceremony, or just there's some need for there to be words of magic. And for that, after a lot of experimentation, what I basically came up with is if it's a word or two, then the translation is then kind of implied in the surrounding context. If there is a passage, for that I have both those like one or two words, but particularly for the passages, or at least something that is more than like 2 or 3 words. I have a whole glossary at the back of every single book. And it makes for a rather interesting experience of ensuring that everything is just right, since there is no check for this grammar other than me. And there's no one else who knows this language other than me, so there's no one who can help me in this. My editor has no insight into this process. So between the glossary of one book and the actual text, that's where that whole thing is reconciled. Alongside that, there are some places in which, since technically my characters are not speaking English, there has to be this sort of understanding that the language they're speaking is actually not like this. And every now and then I have occasion to add that in, that they are putting together these syllables or writing, instead of writing letters or the alphabet, they write runes, because at least at some point, I'm going to be making a written language to complement this fantastic spoken language. And between the one and the other, I try to achieve a, I guess, Tolkien-esque vibe of a true fantasy language that's being spoken. And before I pass it off to the next person, in names, there is no translation as such offered. If you ask me about it, I would tell you where it came from and what it means in the story. Sometimes my characters imply it, but there is no translation offered as such, because they're not supposed to be translated. And I also don't tend to give where the words come from, since that is supposed to be part of the mythos.
How about you, Cristina?
So this has been very interesting, because I've been lately translating my own stories from Spanish into English. And I had to also make the decision of what am I going to translate and what I'm not going to translate. And I decided if there are expressions, long expressions, like sentences, like as the character I was mentioning before, I have this character that speaks multiple languages. Sometimes when there's a sentence, I translated it, and you can, with a footnote, you can see what it means. But there are certainly, I decided there's certain Spanish words I will not translate it from the original. Like, for example, in this case, bionautas, I'm not going to translate it, even though it's a Greek. It's a Spanish word, but it comes from Greek, bionautas. So like searchers of life or something like that could be the translation. But so even though I am translating myself, I have a native speaker who's doing the proofreading, and she came to tell me, actually, Cristina, it's better if you don't translate certain things. So, you leave also your mark, and also there are distinctive words that you don't really need to translate. I think that it would be nice if you don't translate them, like neurotema, which is it's a system where people coming out of space are able to talk to each other telepathically and not using the spoken word. So I also had to incorporate things like, how is it to speak a language where there's no words, because you can't use a lot of oxygen space. So you just go to just send your thoughts or your thinking, but it has to be in like a sequence kind of way, like in a language kind of way. How do I incorporate that in a story? Because those kind of thoughts, it's not spoken. And I kind of translate it also in a way where I use direct dialogue, like the dialogue you have in screenplays, or in screenplays or in theater, to kind of show that kind of sending out or transmitting your thinking, not words, because it's very difficult if you're using words. How do you express something that it's not words, right? So so I did that, and I considered that kind of like also kind of a translation kind of thing, because also you're trying to incorporate something that's not really English or Spanish either. So I also wanted to mention that when, I don't know why, but I have this kind of fixation that when I write fantasy and I want to write the names of my characters, I try to go into languages that are far away from mine and pick the ones that sound the best. And for me, at least, Turkish, it's been wonderful because I have a lot of Turkish friends and they have awesome, super words for names that you wouldn't know if it's male or female, but they're very sonoro. They sound great, and nothing as they don't sound to me, at least, anything like I've heard before. And I thought that was a great source of names, for example, for my fantasy stories. And I would recommend anybody to go to any language they're not really familiar with and try to go through the kinds of names they use. They're going to discover things that are super interesting, and maybe not necessarily to use for their story, but maybe that to, for certain words or for just for inspiration. I just think that it's really inspiring to learn how other people use words, and the names. The names is something so important that I think we all really go through pains to name our characters and to make them something different and interesting. That I really recommend that, because to me, I have lists and lists because they are super awesome. I couldn't tell you about Orkun, Serdar, Hüsnü. I mean, it's unbelievable the way that sounds. To me, is really fantastical. So I would recommend that. I think that looking into people's culture is always a plus.
How about you, Joaquin?
Oh, gosh.
It was like, when do you include or imply
No,
translation?
I was trying to organize the mess that
Oh.
usually goes on there. I don't multitask. I million task. I was thinking of what Cristina was saying about some things being implied, and actually what Amena planted the sort of the base for, which has some rules about what gets translated and what doesn't, which is very smart. I do it by context. The rule I follow is I come from cinema, so I don't break the line of action. That is my Bible. The action in the scene is what I care about. The languages I'm using, even they might have a lot to do with the story and might be crucial to the development, they're secondary to the interplay of the scene, the flow of the scene, so to speak. And so I don't have a rule really, but if one of the characters is in dialogue, let's jump to the conclusion. In dialogue, it's exquisitely easy, because you can have one of the characters drop a word in Martian. I mean, I'm thinking of A Stranger in a Strange Land, like grok, and someone can drop a strange word in the middle of a phrase, and someone can ask, no, We're not running around asking for the platitudes of the audience. That is for actors. We're detectives. We have to start doing our job and stop doing strange things. I'm just, ad-libbing, but the idea is that I just justified or explained, mansplained, a word from one side of the dialogue with another side of the dialogue. And that works. If you don't overdo it, that works very well to keep, as long as you keep the flow, because that's the only sin I see, that you stop the narrative to drop an explanation. No, no. I prefer you drop the word and in the flow of the thing, you answer it as you use one of the usual most like outrage. Oh, no, how do this kind of thing, the dialogue itself be the translation in the emotions used and in the situation depicted. So it comes to execution. The other thing is when there is a phrase, and I love, well, Tolkien does that, but also Edgar Rice Burroughs. He doesn't explain, but by half of the book, you understand that Mangani means ape, Go Mangani means dark ape, Tar Mangani means pale ape, and so forth. So by now you have the races down, and you can start seeing what group fights with whom. And you also get a smattering of the language. And then he does this thing, which I think is brilliant. He names, say, the animals with the names of the jungle, right? So, but he immediately gives you the translation as a title, which I think is brilliant. Sabor the lioness, Cheetah the leopard, Ka the snake. They're titles, they're not translations per se, they're titles. And by you adding the strange or different word to the translation and capitalizing it, even if it's with the voice, even if it's not, Burroughs does it with actual capitals on the page, and Cheetah the leopard with an uppercase L, but the Tantor the elephant type thing. And I think it's brilliant because then you have a trick to drop in what Cristina was talking about, outlandish names that no one would be able to really relate to a character unless you tell them to. And in the same big swipe, you do it. So that's, again, I insist, or I remark, it comes to execution. The way you do it is, it's all in the wrist, and you have to maintain your action going and use these things not as rocks to interrupt the flow, but rather as river stones to direct it and make it more interesting, but keep the current going. It's because I think that's the only thing that is a sin for a writer, is to bore the reader. Strange words.
And how about you, RM?
Yeah, so I think you both of you kind of answered my part, but just to reiterate, I feel too like I have always, well, I'm a very visual person, so the scene that I'm writing, when I write it, is taking place in real time in my head. And I did start writing, but mid-writing career, I did study film and screenwriting. And even though I still liked novel writing more, just because you got to, write more and not cut out so much of the detail, I did realize that a lot of the time when I'm writing dialogue, I do write it like a movie. So I'm seeing the characters and what they're doing. And I'm kind of putting that straight onto the page. Like, I have a lot of dialogue tags usually because I'm just explaining, especially as somebody who is not always good, comfortable, can speak. And I do talk a lot with my hands or kind of use body language more in a lot of situations if I'm uncomfortable or, don't know a person really well, et cetera, et cetera. It was a lot easier for me to kind of do that on the page. So in real time, the scene is happening, the character says what they're going to say. But like Joaquin said, it doesn't feel like, oh, we're stopping to put a spotlight on this word. Like, no, this is very normal for them, for the character. They're
Mhm.
saying what they have to say. The other character has to respond to that. So I basically, all my translations are based on context. There are times where I will do kind of like the inner monologue thing of the other character being like, oh, this is what they meant, not outright, so it looks like a footnote, but just like, oh, this is how I'm going to react to it. I don't have to react to it uh, out loud. I'm kind of just processing it in my head. So that's a little easier, but I really don't do like outright translations. I never feel like it's necessary. I definitely feel like the context of the scene and what's going on in the scene is much more important, and those actions are much more important to me because really, the characters are just talking. Uh, they're gonna be talking no matter what. We all talk a lot in my head, so it's just you're talking, and then the scene is happening, and you kind of garner the gist of what is going on based on that. So I just let basically, the writing from there speak for itself, and kind of, if you need the translation for the word, then you can go ahead and look it up the way you would look up an English word that you didn't know. But I obviously feel very strongly about that just because obviously living in America, it is you're frowned upon or what have you for speaking in another language or speaking in an accent. And again, having editors constantly tell you maybe you should just take all the non-English out, maybe you should just use this word instead. And I'm very much of the I'm not going to do that. And I will not longer be taking your input if this is the road we're going down. And I feel very strongly about that. And I've told other younger authors the same thing of like, if they feel like it's too much for somebody to go Google translate 3 words, they don't care about your story. So you could just walk away now. You have every right to just walk away. And I feel very strongly about that because again, I grew up in New Mexico, and you would think in New Mexico that they'd be like, Spanish is pretty widely spoken in New Mexico, right? But when I was in, kindergarten, first grade, all the kids that spoke Spanish, and I wouldn't even call Spanish my first language. I knew enough of it to get around a conversation, but they would send you to, bilingual trailers, which really meant stop speaking Spanish. So you would, go through this, and that's a question in the future, I don't remember, but it's just in speaking Spanish, it's especially for my family who doesn't speak it much anymore now that my great great grandparents have passed away. It's kind of a difficult topic to get into because obviously in America, speaking Spanish is a revolutionary act. For my family still in Mexico, it's a point of our colonization. It's a prominent issue that you have to grapple with every time you step over the very proverbial but altogether still real boundary between an indigenous Mexican identity and an American Latino identity. So having to look at both of those things and kind of be like, you can't really compare those evils, the history of both of those points of colonization. And then for me to also be Black, that adds a whole nother thing into it. But I think I remember Daniel Jose Older, he did a video about translations and just like how, we used to do the italics, where we would put a Spanish word and he would be like, we don't talk like that. Why would we do that? And the video was really funny, but it made a great point. So I, mostly stopped doing translations altogether until I could make it seem very natural, and I wasn't actually pandering to the audience that didn't speak that language, because again, in America, I don't feel comfortable doing that. And my first audience is all of the minorities in America who can say, oh, this is my language. Oh, we're speaking it. Oh, we're comfortable speaking it here. It's not treated like other. It's not treated like, inferior or less than. This is our language and we get to speak it here and we get to be celebrated for it, or at least treated like normal, treated with the same respect as English. So I really try to do that when I'm writing, so that it just seems like, oh, like, yeah, it's in context, boom, you understand that. And then obviously, again, there are so many words in both Greek and Nahuatl that they have been taken and repurposed in English, Spanish, like, tamale, tamal, that's Nahuatl word. So that's some, everybody knows what tamale is. So I don't really need to, even though it's spelled different, because I use the Nahuatl spelling, you know what it is because they're eating it. So you can kind of guess of like, oh yeah, that's what it is. So I kind of just go off of that, because again, like what I've always said is my writing is for my communities. I am inviting people outside of my community into that story. So you have to be comfortable with decentering yourself when you're reading those stories, because this is for my people, because we didn't have this growing up. We didn't have these stories. So that's really important to me, is just to make it seem like this is, you're walking into another world and learning a different language, and you can, absolutely 100% come in, but we're not going to take off your shoes for you and make it real comfortable, for you. I think you can be uncomfortable for a little while, as we've been our entire lives. But also a side note on that, though, to what Cristina was saying, I do also really love Turkish. I watch Turkish dramas a lot. I wish I had, since I have Greek and Nahuatl already on my plate, I haven't, gone to. Yes, I'm going to learn Turkish next, but I think it is a wonderful, beautiful language, and it sounds so romantic, especially in the drama. So I really like listening to it. It's a very big fan. 10 out of 10 would recommend. So, but yeah, that's my take on it.
And Korean too.
Yes, of course. Those are all. I mean, just watching the dramas in general, it all just sounds so much more magical. Because you're like, well, yeah, it sucks that you have to, like, I'm very ADHD, so reading, subtitles is necessary but difficult at the same time. But just being able to listen to it, sometimes that's more than enough, because it just sounds so much. It sounds like so much more than what you're used to or what you're getting. So it does really seem like a magical experience just to listen.
Okay, well, normally I translate, as I told you, Brenda and friends, normally I translate everything from Spanish to English. 97% of the times I normally translate my Spanish. But when making these adaptations, as I told you, sometimes I really check with other American friends, agreeing for the Multi-Lingual podcast, my friend Stacy Hawks, that she has been a really great friend and also a really great mentor and really good reader, because as an American reader, she told me, hey, Darío, why you don't change these words that doesn't match with English? How about if you literally put the word that you put in Spanish and in the American story, and then you write a little bit of a paragraph that explains that word, that explains the sentence you were trying to say to the audience, that is not working in English literally, but in Spanish it's really working. For example, if I'm writing, I'm going to tell you in Brigade DXT. In Brigade DXT, I'm going to put, this Mexican kid comes from the town of Iztapalapa, Mexico City. Well, Iztapalapa, as the Latinos, as the Mexican audience know, is a town, a very famous town in our country. But the American audience is going to say, okay, what is Iztapalapa? What is this place all about? And I like to explain in the English version, okay, look, this word comes from the Nahuatl, the language of Nahuatl, from the Aztecs in the past. And also, this place is very famous for this music. Also, it's because I was born there, so I really like to have all my characters from that part of Mexico City and explain to the audience what it's all about this word, no? So sometimes, as I told you, it's better not to translate some things because I want people to really investigate what it's all about with the clues I left behind in the story. So basically that's it, Brenda, friends.
All right. Well, thank you. We've run out of time, but this was very, very interesting. And I think it's going to be very useful to everyone who's going to be watching us. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time to record this.